I don't know that I or anybody else could understand all of it. Every day that passes, I'm more and more surprised by what strikes me as the absence of any reason or logic.
I agree with you. The fact that we're still talking about this and it's potentially going to be 10 more years, but we'll get into that. I don't want to get
Yeah.
ahead of myself. Um, why do you think President Biden would commit the United States, the US taxpayer, and the US military to helping Ukraine for the next 10 years? Are they planning to drag us into war? Is this to cover up crimes of the Biden crime family? Is this out of kindness? Like, I don't understand what Biden is thinking.
Well, consider the following points. First of all, I'm not sure Biden is thinking at all. I think he's simply saying or doing or signing whatever is put in front of him. I just don't see him as the man who's actually in charge. I think the people who are running the show are behind the scenes. And probably Sullivan and Blinken are closest to being those individuals that represent their views, the views of these wealthy billionaires that are really running our country right now through the White House. I guess you could probably say Lloyd Austin has some role, but I've simply seen him repeat whatever he's told to repeat in public. What he actually thinks, I'm told, is something different. But at this point, it's academic. I think we have to understand, first of all, there is no strategy of any kind anywhere. There has never been any strategic analysis done that would point us in the directions that we are moving now. There's no strategic rationale for challenging Russia's national security, threatening Russia's national security and the Russian people on the basis of what's happened in eastern Ukraine. There simply isn't. The only interest we ever had from the moment this war began was in making peace, finding a way out of the conflict and sparing people's lives and creating some stability. That's all gone out of the window, ostensibly because the billionaires that are running the show behind the scenes want war with Russia because they still want to destroy it. They want to strip it of its resources, enrich themselves in the process. And by now, one would think that that particular pipe dream has gone away, but it continues to animate behavior. And then, of course, you've got lots of people on the Hill, as well as in the White House, who've made outrageous policy pronouncements, and they simply can't retreat from those. If you've said from the beginning that there could be no peace on any terms other than Putin's removal, a Russian retreat, how do you get to a peaceful settlement? I mean, it's just impossible. Biden repeated it quite recently when he was in Europe. He said, asked about coming to some sort of arrangement along the lines that currently exist on the ground in eastern Ukraine. He said, well, that's impossible. That's an unjust outcome. We can't support that, so the war must go on. I think it's all going to fall apart shortly. The Europeans don't want anything to do with this, Steve. They really don't. And the European leaders have just discovered that they're on very thin ice, that the majority of the populations that vote, and that includes Poland, by the way, that was previously in the forefront of impaling itself on the Russian sword, they want nothing to do with it. They want it to be over. They're tired of it. And there are other problems that contribute to this. They're sick to death of all these migrants that have taken up residence in their countries who will never be Europeans, don't want to be Europeans. In fact, if anything, they're there to transform Europe into something it doesn't want to be. So all of these things work together to sabotage the people in power. And what do you do if you face failure all the way around? If you're Joe Biden or you're Lindsey Graham or Chuck Schumer, you double down. You continue to do what you're doing. You never admit defeat. You never admit that you were wrong. You never admit that any mistakes were made. And you sort of pass everything off as anything but my position is immoral, which of course is ridiculous. The same thing is true right now in Israel. The Israelis have gotten themselves into a terrible fix. And if they try to de-escalate in any way, they think that they have lost. If you can't de-escalate because you'll lose, what do? You double down on what you're doing, you expand the war, and then hope that we will ride in on the white horse and rescue you from this disaster that you've started. So Biden and his supporters, and I would say the uniparty, you can call them rhinos, neocons, globalists, they all fit within the same category of uniparty. These are the people that have no interest in the United States and its interests, no interest in the American people, because if they had any interest, the borders would be closed. You know, we'd be imposing law on all the people in this country who are not citizens. We would be punishing criminals. We're not doing any of that. So they don't care about the United States. They're pursuing an agenda that is completely divorced from it. This is bad news for the American people. It's also very dangerous for the world. But I think in Europe, at any rate, there's a higher probability that the governments that are there now will be gone soon. Now, that doesn't mean that the next ones that come in will change everything immediately, but they will begin to. And I think that's one of the reasons that Putin has exercised so much patience. In Israel, there's no chance for that to happen. If Netanyahu were to back away and say, whoops, it's time to de-escalate. We have to come to some other solution in Hamas. We don't want to fight Hezbollah. He'd be gone. He's just out of business. 80+% of the Israeli people are absolutely committed to the complete destruction of the people and the buildings that we call Gaza. And they feel very much the same way about Hezbollah. And they know that's very dangerous. Hezbollah is infinitely tougher nut to crack than Hamas. But they're willing to risk it for the reason that I just outlined. It could bring in Iran, and that's fine with them. They want a showdown with Iran, but they want us to do the showing. That's the problem.
Gotcha. You brought up Senator Lindsey Graham. In just the last week, he said the reason that we have to destroy Putin is there's trillions of dollars in resources in Ukraine. So in Senator Graham's mind, does all this human life value go out the door when he has donors like BlackRock and others that stand to benefit from the trillions of dollars if they can keep them out of Putin's hands?
Well, I never saw any evidence that Lindsey Graham was worried about the loss of American life in Iraq or Afghanistan, particularly when we were sending people to conduct pointless patrols, showing our presence, and we would go down roads day after day, week after week, and be blown to pieces. I don't remember Lindsey Graham raising hell about that. I don't think he's ever been interested in what is necessarily humanity. He certainly doesn't care about Ukrainians and how many die. He's the man that told everybody, oh, this is a bargain. They're doing damage to Russia, and we haven't had to sacrifice anybody to do it. I mean, that's a hell of a comment.
Yeah.
Look, this entire thing in Ukraine has always involved resources. First of all, you're talking about great quantities of coal and iron ore in eastern Ukraine, components of steel manufacturing. There are other things there, including uranium deposits. There undoubtedly are rare earths that we haven't heard much about in many places. And there's also natural gas, as well as offshore natural gas and oil, all along the Black Sea coast. Nobody's brought it up, and it's interesting that they bring it up now to justify the slaughter of all these Ukrainians. because that really wasn't uppermost in Putin's mind, because he saw Ukraine as a neutral state that would be a partner for Russia and a partner for the West, and everybody could assist in the exploitation and self-enrichment that these resources meant. We've now suddenly said, oh, Putin is winning because he's getting all the resources, and we're not going to get any. It sort of reminds me of Afghanistan. There are rare earths in Afghanistan, by the way, along with other precious metals and minerals. And the Chinese are in there mining them. And we said, oh, if we leave, then the Chinese get these. Well, this could go on and on and on. It's just another sort of brick in the edifice of stupidity and insincerity that characterizes the conduct of our foreign and defense policy.
Yeah. Almost everybody that I've spoken with about Russia sending warships loaded with hypersonic missiles to Cuba said it made them feel very uncomfortable. You and I have said on my program, how would the United States feel if Russia suddenly put missiles into Mexico? Well, here we go. They're putting them into Cuba. Do you think Putin was trying to give the United States a taste of what it feels like to have foreign warships, foreign missiles, nuclear subs right on our border?
Well, as you and I have previously discussed, I've mentioned this many times, nobody pays attention to it because they can't see it. But the Atlantic and the Pacific have Russian submarines in them. In other words, we've always had Russian subs offshore. This is not new. What's new is that they brought over surface vessels and parked them in view of everyone along with a submarine. And they're talking about hypersonic missiles. The reason they talk about those, and that's anything that flies faster than 5 times the speed of sound. You're talking about 1,600 feet per second and above. You can't stop it. In other words, we have no means of defending against it. Notice they didn't mention anything nuclear. They simply said hypersonic missiles. Yes, he's trying to say what's good for you is good for us. If you're going to park in our backyard and threaten us, don't be stupid. We can park in your backyard and threaten you. And remember that virtually all the states south of the border, with a few exceptions, are anti-American. They're hostile to us. They have always been hostile to us, even when they were not officially hostile to us. We're the North American Yankee white Protestant power, and they are Catholic and Latino. And there's always been that divide. So it's an easy divide to exploit. Why did the Mexicans welcome Germans into Mexico during World War I? Why did they transform themselves into the largest single KGB headquarters, outlet, and surveillance capability anywhere in the world outside of Russia in Cuba and in Mexico? Actually, Mexico's KGB operation was even larger than Cuba's. So this has been going on for a long time. Those countries were against us during the so-called Cold War. All the Russians are doing is something else that I said back in January of 2022. And when I was asked by Dmitry Simes, what can the Russians do? And I said, one of the things they can do is escalate against us horizontally. Well, where can they escalate horizontally? North Korea, Cuba, probably Mexico, any number of places they can go. And so if you know that and you know you're vulnerable, which is what they pointed to, our vulnerability, then why would you do what we are doing? And it makes no strategic sense. Remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved for a whole range of reasons, but one of the resolutions was we would remove our nuclear warheads on missiles in Turkey. We would bring those missiles back to the United States. Well, we had already planned to do that, Stephen. but somebody forgot about it. I know that sounds hard to imagine, but somebody said, well, we'll do it, but we don't have to do it right away. It turned out that the presence of those missiles was a big deal for the Soviets, obviously. But we said, look, you pull them out and we'll get those missiles out. And we came to an arrangement. Today, you don't have to have missiles in Cuba to destroy us. We don't have to put missiles in eastern Ukraine to destroy Russia. We can all do it with intercontinental ballistic missiles. But everybody knows what that means. It means Armageddon. It means 90 million dead in the United States in the first hour of a nuclear exchange. And then we would estimate another 90 million would die in the next 6 months as a result of cancer and other diseases that destroy them, resulting from the radiation. So nobody's going to use nuclear weapons. I think that's pretty clear. I really don't see it. The Russians have made it very clear they will not use it unless it's used against them. So what do you turn to? You turn back to the conventional level. That's why you're hearing about hypersonic missiles. And frankly, if you had a choice between a megatonnage or kilotonnage and nuclear warheads versus a hypersonic missile, you'd buy the hypersonic missile strike in a minute. I don't think the Russians are interested in that. In fact, I know they're not. The Russians want an end to this war. But they've come forth on more than one occasion with proposals. The latest one, which is from my standpoint, really quite astonishing that they would even bother putting anything on the table and talking to us, because we've never been willing to do so. And once again, we've immediately rejected anything they've said. We're back to where we started this conversation. I can't admit I was wrong. And who cares how many people die as a result of my ego, which is what it boils down to.
Oh, okay. Zelensky was asked, if Trump gets back into office, do you think that he will support the Ukraine war effort at the same level that Biden did? And his answer was very vague. He said, well, I think if the people are with us, Trump will be with us, but I don't think very many people are on the side of the Ukraine war anymore. In the beginning, everyone flew a flag, but there were no parades, there were no campus riots. It wasn't the same level that we see in Israel and Gaza. And so almost everyone I talk to is like, where's the 200 billion? Are they winning? How many people have died? I just don't think the people are with them. I don't think Trump will be with him. What are your thoughts on his comments?
Well, if President Trump were to become president again, and he were allowed to act in accordance with what he thinks is right or his political instincts, he would shut down the Ukrainian war immediately. But remember that he's a prisoner of his donors. This is what people don't understand now. I'm sure you heard about this Mrs. Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, who is publicly offering, I guess this is a bribe, $100 million to the Trump campaign if he promises to underwrite and support the devastation and ethnic cleansing of the so-called West Bank, pushing all the Arabs south of the Jordan River so that Greater Israel becomes a reality. And she says, if you promise to do that, then I'll give you $100 million for your campaign. Now, personally, if somebody said that to me, I would be deeply offended. And I would think every American citizen would be offended. What it effectively amounts to is, here's $100 million, and you're going to perform duty as my mercenary and help me to eliminate anybody I don't like that's on my borders or in my region. But this is the way people do business now. So he's got some very powerful donors. And by the way, he's not alone. All the candidates have donors. And all of those donors have influence because they've got lots of money. The last person who is consulted is the American citizen. When's the last time we had a referendum on anything in this country? How about a referendum on the Ukraine war? We could do that, couldn't we? And you'd get a resounding no. How about we go to the Middle East and make war on everybody that Israel doesn't like? I think we'd get a resounding no. Okay. But they're never consulted, and the average American does not have the money to bribe candidates or politicians to do things. So your question is a legitimate one, but it really says something terrible about the American political system right now. We really do have the best government money can buy.
Yeah. I remember hearing one time that Trump was insulated in his first term from the pressure of the donors because of how he ran his 2015 campaign, but the people around him were not, and then they had influence, and so everybody is able to be influenced, and this military industrial complex. I believe Adelson, when her husband was alive, he gave a large donation, and it was that they moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and that did end up happening, and everybody, thought that was a great idea.
Well, you have to understand there's a difference between moving an embassy and going to war. First of all, and when people came to me when the Israelis moved the embassy, I said, fine. They said, well, this will offend the Arabs. I said, any country in the world has the sovereign right to place its embassy wherever its government as well as its embassy wherever they like. In other words, it's not a matter for our decision. So that was an easy thing to do, and at the time I had no problems with it. And my own view is that any country anywhere can do the same thing. Now, having said that, going to war is a different prospect. If somebody asks you to support them for something that leads inevitably to warfare and conflict that will involve the use of American military power and American lives, that's a different one entirely. And we're now at that point. And several people call me all the time and say, well, Doug, that's why we have to have a draft, because then the American people would feel the pain. I don't think the American people are quite that inured to pain. I think Americans are always disturbed when they find out that American soldiers in some remote area are being killed. And if a large number are killed within a short period of time, they immediately say, what are we doing there? So the game historically over the last 30 years has been to minimize your casualties and work closely with the media to suppress any appreciation for what's happening and what's developing. As a result, people have been able to make policy in Washington without much constraint. This is now very, very dangerous because in eastern Ukraine, this whole Ukrainian project launched by the CIA in 2014 with Victoria Nuland and others is collapsing. The only thing that prevents the Russian military from advancing right now over the Dnieper River and coming south out of Belarusia and seizing Kiev is a desire on the part of Moscow to end the war. They would rather negotiate an end to this thing. They just want Ukraine to be neutral, and they'll stipulate those conditions, something on the Austrian state model that worked so well in 1955. But if that's continually rejected, then what do you do if you're in Moscow to end this thing? Exactly what I just described. You cross the river, you take Kiev, you move down to Odessa, and you call it a day and make clear that if anybody crosses into Western Ukraine, that you can target them and destroy them, which they can do right now. If you or I walked across the border from Poland into Ukraine right now. And you and I were on some sort of list of priority intelligence topics. And they saw us. They could pick us up as soon as we crossed into Russia, and they could launch a missile to kill us. I mean, this is the world we live in right now. You have persistent surveillance. Everybody can watch everybody else all the time. The only way to stop that is to destroy space-based surveillance. But if you do that, then eventually they'll get around to destroying yours, and then nobody has any surveillance of anything. And that's very dangerous because of the ICBMs. We rely very heavily on our space-based surveillance to also protect us against the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile that could destroy millions. And the Russians do the same thing. So there are limits to how far you can go. Let's put it this way. And we keep pushing those limits. And if we push far enough, we'll get much worse than what we bargained for. And that's where we are right now in Ukraine. And by the way, it's the same problem in Israel. You know, people are being evacuated from parts of Israel that are within range of Hezbollah, its rockets, its weapons, and even its troops. It's getting worse. Israel is in serious trouble. This really needs to stop, this war. But for them, stopping equals defeat, so they won't. There's not a whole lot we can do. We have no influence whatsoever over Netanyahu. He has much more influence over our government and our armed forces than we do right now. And when it comes to Russia, we continue to pretend that it doesn't make any difference what they say. We stick by the original lie that hatched the whole plan. We keep insisting that Russia is losing. I mean, Russia will still be losing, I'm quite sure, when they're sitting on the Polish border fishing in the river. This is insane, but this is where we are. So I think it is useful to say, what if President Trump gets in? What if you get somebody other than the current crew? And I think almost anybody who comes along will quickly put an end to the Ukraine war. It just makes no sense. It's a waste of time, money, and resources. The Europeans have had it. The Scholz government's in real trouble. And once that government in Berlin goes, there'll be more flexibility. Although I would also argue something else, and people don't understand this. When you've had so much trouble, so much conflict, so much corruption, and you get a new government, everyone expects the new government to fix everything immediately. It never happens. So they don't last. You'll go through 2 or 3 iterations before you finally get to a place where everyone is comfortable. So on the one hand, I'm grateful that these European powers are now in political turmoil because they need it. They really do. They need new governments. But we can't expect everything there to change immediately. But one thing that I think will happen is this war in eastern Ukraine will end. It's ridiculous. It's so destructive. Problem then is turning to Israel. And I don't see how anybody gets control of Israel other than Washington. And Washington is on the payroll. Everybody there is on the payroll. They're profiting from their support of the lobby. And so I see nothing changing there. And that's very, very dangerous for the future of Israel.
Yeah. When you used your hypothetical of you and I crossing the border from Poland into Ukraine, I learned this last week that I'm actually on Zelensky's kill list. I'm sure you're on it as well.
Yeah.
So I'll never be going to Ukraine because telling the truth about the Ukraine war has now put my life in danger. So I'm sure.
Well, the sad part is that, and I don't know much about it. No one wants to be on someone's death list. But in this day and age, if you take any position that contradicts the mainstream view or conventional wisdom, you're on somebody's death list somewhere. The bad news is that I'm told this death list is run out of Langley, which is closely aligned with and tied to the SBU, the secret police in Ukraine. the equivalent of the KGB in Soviet times. So, the thing that's disturbing is that we're too deeply involved with foreign countries, foreign interests, foreign actors. I think it was John Mearsheimer who recently made the observation, if it were in our interest to do whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants, there would be no Israel lobby. He wouldn't need it. But the fact is that we're acting against our own interests in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. So you have to ask the question, why are we acting against our own interests? And it goes back to money. Who are the big donors? Who are the people with all the money? How do they reach people? How do they contact them? How do they get them elected? And how do they block others from being elected? This is what the game is about now.
Yeah, it is a big game. Let's bring the topic back home. There's been discussion of these 51 intelligence agents or officers that signed this letter at the behest of Antony Blinken to cover up the Hunter Biden laptop. They're saying, let's not put the American people through 51 investigations. Let's just revoke their security clearance. That affects their employment, and they can't do any further damage. What are your thoughts on those 51 that knowingly misled the American people? Should they have their security clearance removed?
Oh, I absolutely would pull their clearance. That's the least that you can do. And then I would put together a prosecution and go after them because they betrayed the trust of the American people. This is the big problem. When you take an oath in the Department of Defense or in the military, you swear to uphold the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to obey the orders of the officers appointed over you. Well, there's a conflict there. On the one hand, you're supposed to obey the officers appointed over you, and you're supposed to simultaneously be true to the Constitution. What happens if obeying the officers violates your loyalty and oath to the Constitution? We've got to resolve this because this is not unique to the CIA. This is a problem that runs across the entire federal government. But I think the CIA is one of these organizations that deserves a lot more attention than it gets. There's practically no oversight. The budget is a very vague thing. We can't really audit it effectively. It's even worse in some respects than the Department of Defense. It's a black hole. It's been a rogue organization for many, many years. I don't know who is behind all 51 of those officers, but obviously they signed that assuming two things. First of all, I'm violating my oath by aligning myself politically with something as opposed to simply doing my job as an intelligence analyst. And then secondly, I'm probably doing what the people above me want me to do. Now, undoubtedly, much like you see in the Department of Defense, the people that want to be generals and admirals, they unquestioningly obey everything. And if you want them to be diversity conscious, equity conscious, you name it, they're, oh, yes, please pick me. I'll enforce all those dumb policies. Oh, yes, I'll promote everybody regardless of any demonstrated character or competence. They could be idiots, and I'll vote for them if you tell me that's what I need to do. This is a big problem, Stephen. And you gotta clean house in Washington. You got to get rid of a lot of people and start over. Do you really think that anybody who will be elected in November or comes to power in November, one way or the other, do you think any of them can do that? I'm very, very pessimistic.
Like Vivek Ramaswamy is the one who talks about it the most, but I don't know that he'll have a cabinet position. And even if he did, will he actually have the authority and the power to get it done? I just think, the the swamp is going to do everything it can to protect the swamp. And
Yes.
we've seen that. We've seen that. All of these cover-ups against Trump, and it's all about, in the end, it all boils down to protecting the money and the interest of the Washington, D.C. elites.
Well, it's also a rarity that a president actually picks the vice presidential candidate he wants to run with him. Normally, that's done by donors. People with powerful bank accounts and interests. How did Henry Kissinger become the national security advisor for Richard Nixon? Because of a man named Nelson Rockefeller, who had contributed millions to Nixon's campaign in 1968. And so he said, I'll support you, Dick. I'll do whatever you like, but you have to take Henry Kissinger as your national security advisor. So he took him. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. This sort of thing is being the case. And I'm sure right now, donors will pick cabinet members, that align with their agendas, whatever those agendas are. And there are all sorts of agendas in Washington. You just look at the Green New Deal, a disaster, on steroids for everybody. But there are people that are absolutely unwavering in their demand for that. I'm sure that their supporters will get critical positions in a future administration. It's just the nature. It's the nature of the way we run the show. But the problem now is, I don't think we've ever seen quite as much money as we do today in politics. It's just a tidal wave. And it's very difficult for anyone running for office to ignore the tidal wave.
Yeah, yeah. I was shocked recently to learn that Mike Pence became Trump's vice president at the insistence of Chris Christie. I didn't realize that he had a hand, and Chris Christie just loves Donald Trump.
Well, Jeb Bush, I'm told, was the one who went to Pence long before the convention and said, you are going to be the vice president regardless of whomever we nominate. So I think Pence was backed by the Bushies, probably some other critical players with lots of money. And grudgingly, I think Donald Trump said, all right. I mean, one of the things that President Trump said from time to time in the first two and a half to 3 years of his administration was, I'm the decider, no one else. And so frankly, whoever else may be in this administration doesn't matter. I'm the one who makes the decisions. I think he got an education. That's not true. Yeah. Presidents really don't have as much flexibility and freedom of maneuver as they think. And once they get in there, they're dealing with these realities. Biden is the exception because he's not even, I don't think he's even conscious of what's going on. But it's the same principle at work. So people that think that someone is going to emerge as a result of the ballot box and save us, in other words, we have to elect candidate X, he is going to save us. They're delusional. I keep telling people, if you want to be saved, you're going to have to save yourself. People look at you, this dumb look, huh?
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the U.S. border crisis. The Democrats are playing a pretty crafty game right now where we know that they've done nothing to protect the border. They've set the Republicans up with this bill that wasn't very good. And now Biden's, his hand has been forced to do this executive order to secure the border. And yet the same amount of people are coming in. Most countries, they're saying, well, just let them in. Like nothing changed. And yet I think Democrats believe, oh my gosh, this guy stepped up and he saved the border. Is this whole thing to give him talking points before the first debate?
Who knows? I don't know. I'll be surprised if there is any debate. I don't think Biden's going to be the nominee. I think on 19 August, they'll announce somebody else is stepping in. Here's the bottom line. Right now, the official numbers suggest that we have at least 52 million people living inside our borders who are not born here. Now, the number is probably higher, to be frank. All the numbers are turning out to be much higher than everybody thinks. Somebody said by the time Biden goes away, there will have been over 30 million new illegals added to the pile. It may be higher than that. The question that Americans should ask is why? Well, what's behind this? Why is this happening? Why hasn't the Senate or the House intervened to stop it and override the president? Because there's an expectation that even on its worst day, the American Congress will still think about the American people. Well, they've turned out to be wrong. So what you have right now is a very carefully orchestrated, well-organized invasion. And Michael Yon has done some great work on this. There are others, Ann Vandersteel. They've started in Darien and walked this sort of path to enter the United States illegally in Texas. But you also have large numbers of people from other countries, China and elsewhere, coming in on aircraft into Mexico City and then joining the throng. And then, by the way, we have a lot of people coming in illegally who walk over the northern border or come on false pretenses, in other words, a phony visa. Some of them are flying in. I mean, we really don't know how many millions there are, but the objective is that each of those illegals is given, especially if you come through the Texas border, the last 4 digits of supposedly a Social Security number. And they're told, this is what you need to do in November. You present these 4 numbers as evidence for your citizenship. And you insist you are a citizen, because there's a new clause in the federal law that says if someone shows up and is absolutely convinced that they are citizens, then they may vote. Now, why is this? Because these people are supposed to vote the current people who are governing our country into power permanently. That's all. In other words, this is a Bolshevik-style revolution without the violence, although the violence is picking up because obviously a lot of these illegals constitute a crime wave of their own. And we're having trouble dealing with it because we've constrained the police. And we have judges that have been appointed over the years that seem to be as anxious to destroy the United States as perhaps anyone in history. And how do you do that? Well, you make the law toothless. You reward the criminal. You punish the enforcer. So policemen today are very reluctant to do things because they're afraid they'll end up going to jail instead of the individual that committed the crime. And of course, the whole George Floyd thing, you go all the way back to that and his criminal record and his past. And then the autopsy that said the man was not killed or murdered by that policeman at all. And that policeman didn't do anything that was not practiced all over the country by police departments. It didn't make any difference, did it? He was sentenced, to life or some outrageous, time. That's a big signal. That tells every policeman in the United States, when in doubt, do nothing. So we have this tidal wave of criminality that's sweeping across the country. The people that are in the Border Patrol are distraught. They can't do their jobs. Right now, they're no different from the non-governmental organizations up and down the trail from Darien all the way to Mexico, because the non-governmental organizations are being subsidized even by the federal government, as well as other sources, to help promote this invasion. All of it is designed to denationalize the United States. If you can swamp us with enough people who are fundamentally different from us, culturally, linguistically, ethnically, go down the list. As long as they're radically different from Americans, the average American, they can contribute to the dilution of the American identity, the dilution of the American population, to the point where suddenly we are a minority within our own country and we have little or no authority over our government because the government is now kept in power by these people who are systematically encouraged to invade our country. That's about the best that I can say right now. And there's nobody in Washington that wants to come to terms with this. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. There are a few good men and women, but the majority, no, they're not interested. And as far as they're concerned, they'll get lots of contributions from multiple sources. You keep talking about the military-industrial complex. I could talk about, the energy complex. There are any numbers of different businesses that are happy to break the law and bring in cheap labor. And we know from recent labor statistics that most of the jobs are going today not to American citizens, but to illegals. Well, the argument is, well, the illegals will work for less. Okay, then how do we fix that? We pass a law that it's illegal to hire a non-citizen if there is a citizen present who can do the job. That's true in Austria, by the way. The Austrians have very good laws on this. No one can immigrate into Austria unless there is a demonstrated need for that person. And that only can happen when all of the Austrians who can work are employed. I mean, why don't we do that? Well, we're not doing that because it doesn't pay well for people on the Hill. And it doesn't make money for all sorts of nefarious characters, and I just collectively call them billionaire oligarchs. In the meantime, lost in all of this, once again, is the American citizen.
Yeah. Boy, we sure end up getting the short end of the stick in our own country.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say it's a very long, pointy stick.
Yeah.
And it's being shoved in the wrong places for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh dang. Well, I read a lot of European news, just like I'm sure you do. And I'm watching them be invaded. And it's like, watching a wreck in slow motions. And I'm like across the ocean going, you guys, do you not see what's happening? But again, I think the government leaders know it. They just don't do anything about it. Same thing back here at home. I think the American people and DC government have a very different vision of what the country is and where it's going. And sadly, we're all kind of strapped to this train to crap town.
Well, lots of people live in denial, Stephen. You know that. And if you are not near the border, you can pretend it's really a border problem. In reality, it's everywhere. But people don't care to admit that. And then there's something else. People aren't motivated until they are touched in some dramatic way. When do people rebel against governments? Well, usually it has something to do with not being able to eat. I mean, if you can keep everyone fed, make sure that everyone can drive their car to the 7-Eleven, pick up a six-pack, go home and watch the game on Monday night, then I guess you're probably all right. In other words, we have a lot of sedated consumers in the United States. The sedation has to end. If it doesn't, then we are the proverbial boiling frog that is boiled.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, you and I can continue to raise awareness of this and try and wake people up, get them out of the frying pan. I know you're constrained for time. This has been a very interesting conversation. I appreciate you coming on, appreciate your service to the country. I'm going to put a link to Our Country, Our Choice down below so that people can learn more about that. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye-bye.